Hey folks, in this video, I'm going to talk about the 7 reasons why you should reconsider moving to Portugal if you're a U.S. citizen for 2023 and possibly 2024. And if you haven't met me before, my name is Cinnamon. I'm a U.S. immigrant who left the U.S. and moved to Lisbon, Portugal over 4 years ago. So if you are someone who your earnings or your retirement is in USD, there are some things that we are going to talk about as it relates to currency and conversion and investments. In addition, just to some other things that you might want to know as a U.S. citizen in regards to moving to Portugal. So let's get started. Now, if you were old enough to work or have a retirement account in 2008, there's probably some things that you may be experiencing now as you're looking at the news and the various headlines that are very reminiscent to 2008, 2009, right? The Great Depression, right? So when we think about 2008 recession, one of the things, if you remember, the headlines in the news was all about bank closures, right? And that, as you can look at the news now, is starting to happen now, in addition to various investments, cryptocurrencies. All these things are slowly or quickly imploding. So when we look at history, it's important to understand how that is going to affect us if you're living in America, but especially if you are living outside of America, and particularly Europe, okay? So let's go into that and just put things into perspective. And according to the FDIC, there were 465 banks that closed between 2008 and 2012. 465 nationally, right? And so just to put that in perspective, in years prior, in like 2003, there were 10 bank closings. So the number jumped drastically. And so what does that mean? As the banks start having their issues, of course, interest rates, as you remember before, started to increase and a variety of things started to happen. So now that you are considering moving outside of the country, you really have to consider how your investments and things of that nature will be affected. So speaking of 2008, any idea what the USD to Euro currency conversion was in 2008? Well, I wasn't in Europe in 2008, so it wasn't really on my radar. But now, if you're moving specifically this year or next year, this is something that you really have to be aware of. So let's look at a chart really quickly. So it's important to know that just historically, euros have always trumped the US dollar. Now it's pretty much neck and neck, but currency changes daily, and so that can change tomorrow, okay? But just if you look at a historic chart and you're charting euros to USD conversion, euros are always, not always, but euros are typically worth more money than USD. Okay, so let's just put these things in perspective. So if we look at the peak of when the financial market was going through its changes, in 2008, April was the peak. That meant that 1 euro equaled $1.58 USD. That's a lot, especially if you're making large purchases or your rent can change drastically, by some cases thousands of dollars. So let's just look at that. So if you were paying rent of $1,200 April, where it went to 1.58, you will be responsible for paying almost $1,896. Drastic difference. And if your rent was $2,000, with that currency conversion, you would have ended up paying $3,160 during that time. So again, the reason why that is important is if the US dollar tends to drop the way it did in 2008 when the recession is in full bloom, you will notice your expenses in euros will increase dramatically, and you need to be prepared for that. Now, this can really affect your numbers if you don't put this possible fluctuation in currency into your numbers when you move abroad. It can affect you drastically. And if your retirement account is in USD, and you're converting it to euros and you've lost value in your retirement account or in the conversion, it's something you really need to consider and look out for. Third reason why Americans might want to reconsider moving to Portugal is you really got to have a conversation with yourself and just your comfortability of America. So if you want America, but you just don't want to be in America, you are going to have a hard time coming to Portugal or any country, not any country, but various countries for that matter. Each country has their own culture and way of doing things, And if you are wanting to bring the parts of America that you like and avoid the parts that you don't like without getting into the culture of Portugal or whatever country you decide to move in, you are really going to struggle. You're going to feel like an outsider in a variety of things that you do. Now, to be successful in Portugal or any country for that matter, you have to embrace the culture of the country. You don't want to just stay in this bubble of just being with other people who look and think and act like you do. Like, if you want to stay in this bubble, you might want to question why you decide to move out of the country in the first place. So if you're having a hard time, or if you don't consider those things, when you move to the country, you may find yourself being extremely lonely or just not fitting in because you may not have taken the time to do what's necessary to have a diverse group of friends and experiences that would better enrich your experience in Portugal or wherever you decide to move. Most of the people that I've seen make some extremely costly mistakes are because they never took the time to sit down and learn the culture or develop the relationships or things that are necessary to be successful if you are attempting to do business or get friends or do anything in a country that is foreign to you. The things that you were able to do in America, it might not be as easy, or you might have to develop relationships with certain people, or you might need to know more about the neighborhoods or various things, but get engrossed into the culture so that you will just have a better experience. But from those I've met that are having those problems, the costly mistakes comes because of the lack of education. So if you plan on moving to Portugal and you want to start a business or you want to do a variety of things, take some time to learn more about the culture of the people there. If you are attempting to create friendships with just foreigners or businesses just for foreigners, you may find yourself in a harder position. The whole purpose of moving abroad is to, have these variety of different experiences, meet different people, experience different cultures, in my mind. So if you don't plan on doing that when you move to Portugal, of course you can do whatever you want to do. You're grown. I will say you may have a harder time adjusting and feeling like you belong, or that it may not feel like home to you. And these are just some of the things that people have told me over the years, some who have stayed and some who have gone. But I think if you're thinking about moving here, it's something that you really need to consider. Please take some time to learn the language and get friends that are outside of your comfort zone. Have conversations with people and really get into the culture so that you can have the experience that I hope that you are looking for. Okay, one of the fourth reasons that you may want to reconsider moving to Portugal in 2003 and 2004 is the real estate market here. The real estate market here makes absolutely no sense. It is overvalued, and the quality of what you get, of course it varies, can mean that you've spent a lot of money and it may not be what you want. So for those of you who haven't heard my story, or when I had to get a new apartment over this summer, I'll link the video probably in the description, but it was ridiculous, right? There is no way that I would have to go through what I went through this past summer just to find a rental in the US or various other countries. So you might want to consider that. When you come to visit, it is completely different than being out here in these real estate streets looking for an apartment. It is overpriced for very average amenities. You can definitely find real estate and rentals that are cheaper in the United States, depending on the state, obviously, right? So if you're moving to Portugal just to attempt to save, it's not necessarily what you're going to experience. I would recommend that you have a variety of reasons why you're moving to Portugal. It should not just be money. Again, don't forget about the USD, euros to conversion. But if you think about it, if you're deciding to purchase in Portugal right now, again, the currency numbers are relatively neck and neck, but it's still not equal. So the euros is still worth more than USD. So if you were taking money to put a down payment or to pay off completely your USD money to euros, which you would need more USD because you have to convert it to euros. Getting it, depending on your banking system and things like that, it costs money to get your currency from one country to another. So you have to equate that into your cost as well. So if you have a situation in which, again, we may be running into the 2008 real estate if bankings are slowing down, real estate may slow down as well, not just in the United States, but also all across the world, Portugal being one of those. So if you look at the history of Portugal, tourism hasn't always been Portugal's thing. This is relatively new within the past 10 to 15 years. And so a lot of the economy has come touristic dependent, in my humble opinion. So when that starts to change, then you have to understand if you purchased a property that was too expensive that the average local person couldn't buy it, you now have to understand or process your real estate investments in the country. So as it relates to real estate and purchasing, you need to get very, very educated on the tax implications specifically from Portugal. If you want to sell your property, what are the taxes? If you have more than one property and it's not your primary residence, there's another tax. What are the capital gains tax? You need to know these things if you plan on purchasing your property outside of the United States and into Portugal specifically. Please take the time to get a financial accountant and things in Portugal so you will be aware of the various taxes and things that you will be responsible for when you sell your property. Now, if you're renting like me, and over the summer I was open to renting or buying. Renting ended up being what I'm doing. Will I buy at some point? It's off the table for right now, but just the things I learned about the buying process and just how crazy the rental market is. Again, I already have a video on that. I'll put it in the description. It was insane, and just financially it makes no sense. Now again, we're doing this based on what is potentially going to happen with the financial markets. We do not know, but I'm saying if you're going to move you and your family and your friend or whatever to Portugal, you need to be aware of these things. Okay, fifth reason, if you're American and you're thinking about Portugal, you might want to hold off. Not just hold off on 2003 or 2004, but just in general. The transition from expat to immigrant is a lot, and it's a lot if you're not prepared. And so what do I mean by expat to immigrant? When I talk about the point from being an expat to immigrant, what I'm saying, like now I'm very conscious to say that I'm an immigrant, because as it relates to the federal government, there is no difference between an expat and an immigrant. And I wasn't aware of the negative stigma that comes along with expat, right? So usually, and this is how it happened. I was having lunch with a group of friends, most of them from Portugal, and one asked me, and my friend, if you guys know Margot, asked Margot and I, like, so are you expats or are you immigrants? And I was like, that's semantics, right? Like, isn't it the same thing? And he was like, no, expat tend to want to come to a place and take the resources or do the things they like to do, but they never attempt to learn the language or learn the culture or any of that, or get involved with local people there. And I was like, oh shoot, like I didn't, that's not what my personal experience was that I wanted to have, you know? So I came to Portugal wanting to get into the culture, learn the language, do those type of things. So I did not want to be considered, you know, one of those Americans that just came to the country and could care less about the people and the culture. So I didn't want to be perceived as that. And that's not what I wanted my experience to be. So that's when I got really conscious of, you know, immigrant versus expat. And so I try to be really conscious about that. But the transition is a lot, you know. So when you think about just the progression, because if you are not from here, most likely you are staying in short-term housing and you're working with people who potentially speak your particular language. And then, you know, when you get an apartment and it's someone local and they may or may not speak English, cool, you get over it, right? You have to remember, then when you start like really becoming an immigrant, in which you are embedded and you're going to the doctor and oh God, you are dealing with utilities, and Portuguese is your second language, or you're learning Portuguese, it can be a bit overwhelming, right? Just doing something you want to be easy can turn into a whole ordeal because it's new. And if you find yourself having a hard time in other areas, your transition is going to be harder for you. You may struggle a bit. And so if you plan on moving in 2023, 2024, a lot of things are just elevated just because of the influx and popularity of Portugal. So you can run on YouTube and you'll see a zillion videos of people moving to Portugal or what they think about Portugal. And the purpose of this video for me was to share some things that I want people to consider. I'm not at all trying to be, you know, negative of Portugal. I love the country, but I think as Americans specifically, there are some things you need to consider, and you need to financially consider if you decide to make this move in 2023. If your income is still coming from the United States, so there are massive job loss going all over the United States, and I'm sure you've heard about them. And when you consider Portugal, Portugal is not one of the countries considered in the European Union that has lucrative jobs or high-paying jobs. So even if we look at the statistics from Eurostat, Portugal ranks 17 out of 26 of the European member states. In 2022, the average salary of a full-time employee in the European Union was $35,000, 35,000 euros gross. But in Portugal, the average is well below 22,000 euros. So if you are not retired and you still have to work and you happen to lose your job in the US, it will be difficult for you to find a job, a high-paying job in Portugal. Now, if you lose a US remote job or your business starts to slow down, you are living in a country where it will be hard to find suitable employment. Now, even though the salaries are low in Portugal, the expenses are still pretty high in comparison. Now, if you are retired, it is really important to remember what happened in the Great Depression of 2008. Many people lost their retirement value. So if you're someone who's close to retirement, this is something you really need to consider if you're planning on moving to Portugal. So in 2008, if you had over $200,000 in your retirement account, you lost 25% of your retirement, particularly if it was tied to the U.S. stock market, which majority of retirement accounts are if you don't kind of personally do your own thing. So if you're going to your job and you're doing something very casual like mutual funds, 9 times out of 10, they are connected to the U.S. stock market. So in 2008, 25% is gone of accounts that are higher than $200,000. And if you're getting ready to retire, you don't have time for the rebound. You gonna have to go back to work. So thinking about retiring, moving to a country where the currency is less, and possible deduction in your retirement is something you have to consider, and you have to know the numbers before moving to Portugal or Europe in general. And the last reason that I think you may want to consider or reconsider your move to Portugal if you have a difficult time developing relationships, particularly new relationships, right? So growing up in DC, my friends were people that I grew up with, that I knew, that I may have, done business with. And so when you leave one location and come to another, you have to be able to develop some type of community when you come to the country. And Americans specifically, and if you're thinking about leaving America, you should be aware of the stereotypes that come with, Americans, right? Like, you can't get all sensitive about that when you're trying to move to somebody else's country. Like, Be real. You have to take the time to really look within yourself and understand the stigma that's involved with coming from the culture of America. So what tends to happen is sometimes a lot of the relationships from Americans when they move tend to be transactional. Americans in general are stereotyped as being, very transactional. Of course, not all, but definitely some. So you have to understand that in Portugal and a lot of Europe in general, it is relationship based. So community is super important. Business is done differently here. It's done based on the relationships that you have with people. Marketing is done differently here. How people go about their daily life has a lot to do with the relationships that they've had and that they've enriched over years, if not decades. Okay, so that type of experience is hopefully, if you're moving here, you want to experience. But I do find that sometimes Americans struggle in that area of developing those relationships and may come off as aggressive or transactional. So you really want to be conscious of that. So you have to be comfortable with learning to speak and communicate with people who you may not have known or whatever, and that you have to be okay with that. And I guess those who may struggle with that, it will affect your experience in Portugal. So again, these are just some of the things that I've noticed with knowledge of the financial markets, and then too some of the cultural things that I've experienced over my time here. I am in no way telling anybody what to do. You are grown, you can do what you want. But if you want to have a successful experience in Portugal on the financial side, as well as just getting into the culture side, I hope those tips were helpful. So until next time, guys.